Hello. We are going to talk about processing product of the farm today. So I am going to share my screen. There we go. And do slideshow mode. There we go. All right. Processing product of the farm produce. We're focusing on produce today. This is for a project led by Renewing the Countryside that also includes the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, and University of Minnesota Extension is a major contributor to this presentation. The original project was called Blazing Trails Through the Jungle of Food Regulations, and some of the slides are cribbed from that much longer slide deck. That was funded by North Central SARE. And I want to acknowledge all those who contributed information and or reviewed this training program. So the Local Food Advisory Committee, Maureen Amolo and Amy Johnston with UMN Extension. Maureen has since moved on, but in her extension role, she worked on this material. And Minnesota Department of Health and Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Here is a drive folder where the documents that I'll be referring to are currently housed. I want to offer a couple of disclaimers. These are still in progress. They are really close to done. A version of them will eventually be housed on the extension website, and they'll be with extension formatting. Currently, they're not formatted, and there may be some tweaks to them in the near future. But the majority of the information there has been pretty thoroughly reviewed by Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And so you're welcome to use them. If you have comments or suggestions for improvements to them, please don't hesitate to send those to me. Thank you. All right, we're going to start in with product of the farm, what it is. So product to the farm is an exclusion from requirements to have a food license. And that is specified in Minnesota's Constitution and in Minnesota statutes. It applies to farmers and gardeners selling food they grew on land they occupy and cultivate. And also any products harvested on public land by tribal members in ceded territory is treated the same as product of the farm. Product of the farm is an approved source of food, even though it's excluded from licensing. And there's the fact sheet from the Minnesota Department of Health that says that food procured directly from growers is an approved source. You have to look at the second paragraph on that fact sheet. And I strongly encourage everybody who might want to sell product to the farm to institutions or other buyers to print out that fact sheet, get a highlighter and highlight that second paragraph, because the first paragraph does not have particularly helpful wording about the allowability of product to the farm. It's that second paragraph. Okay, so even though product to the farm is an approved source of food, everybody who's selling it is required to sell only safe, non-adulterated food. And the rest of our presentation will be more or less about how you do that. Product to the farm, a little bit more about the boundaries of it and what it looks like. So it's food that's grown on land you occupy and cultivate. It's okay if that land is rented or leased. A rental or lease agreement is considered occupation of that land. There's no minimum size to your farm. Sales of product to the farm can be to any buyer, including food facilities. And here's the big kicker: no off-farm ingredients can be added. Not even a single grain of salt, not a single splash of lemon juice, not a drop of olive oil, nothing that you didn't produce yourself on your farm. Here are some produce items that can be product to the farm. Meat and dairy and other products can also be product to the farm, but today we're only talking about produce. So we're talking about fruit, vegetables, edible flowers, cultivated mushrooms, herbs, nuts. Grains and dry beans are included here. They're basically considered produce for purposes of the regulation. And also wild foraged foods from your own property are product of the farm. Wild foraged mushrooms are a special case. There was a revision of the Minnesota Food Code in 2019, and now if you are going to be selling to um, any food businesses making wholesale sales, you are required to have that course and to be registered with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture as having had that course. But other types of wild foraged foods do not require that kind of certification. So wild harvested herbs, edible flowers, nuts, grains, etc., are product to the farm if they're harvested on your property that you occupy and cultivate. And again, if harvested by tribal members with gathering rights in ceded territory, it's treated the same as product of the farm. And now we're going to get into talking about processed product of the farm. So there are two actions that end product to the farm status for a product and require a license. And that is if it's being sold by someone other than the farmer who grew it, or if there are added off-farm ingredients. Processing all by itself is not an action that requires a license. However, to make sure that food is safe, there may be other requirements like an inspection or a commercial grade facility or a HACCP plan that stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or other requirements. And I always want to throw this in there. Making vegetables presentable for sale is not processing. In the past, there was some kind of sloppy language used around this, and sometimes it was called processing, but legally it is not. Farmers and gardeners can always do these trimming, washing off field soil, removing outer husks and leaves, using water that has no detectable E. coli. That's not processing, okay? Processing are the things that you do to change the product somehow. So peeling, shredding, dehydrating, steaming, freezing, bagging, canning, fermenting, juicing. All of these things are processing. Dehydrating is an interesting case because with the new Food Safety Modernization Act legislation, dehydrating, as long as it's a single product, not a blended product, that can be done under the produce safety rule instead of under the stricter CGMPs, current good manufacturing practices. We'll talk a bunch more about those. The things that are starred here are special processes that may require additional training, some certification, facilities, and so forth. Those are special processes, the bagging, canning, and fermenting, because those create a low oxygen environment. And low oxygen is what Clostridium botulinum bacteria really like. That's the bacteria that cause botulism. So when you're creating that low oxygen environment by vacuum sealing or canning or fermenting, if it isn't done correctly, that can be a really high food safety risk. So those are special processes that take some extra things. And then juicing also, because juice has been implicated in many, many foodborne illnesses. So if you want to make juice and sell it wholesale, you have to follow the federal guidelines called the Juice HACCP. But there are plenty of things that farmers can do with their farm products that are not special processes, don't require a lot of fancy equipment or special certifications. Farmers can process their product to the farm as long as they're using potable water, which means drinkable water, and appropriate facilities and appropriate processes, and following current good manufacturing practices. Appropriate facilities mean not a home kitchen. We'll talk about that more too. But some of the examples of things that farmers could certainly do is shredding and bagging cabbage, not vacuum sealing it, just bagging it loose, peeled and sliced carrots, chunks of squash, dried mushrooms, frozen berries, even if you want to mash those berries and freeze them, as long as you're not adding other ingredients, frozen rhubarb chunks, and then the frozen apple slices. But if you add lemon juice to prevent browning, that's not product of the farm unless you raise those lemons yourself on your own farm. Okay. A few definitions here. I already mentioned approved source. So approved or approved source means sources of food that food businesses and food facilities can legally buy. And then exemptions and exclusions. We're not going to talk about exemptions here. Those are exemptions from licensing requirements that are spelled out in statutes. We are talking about the product to the farm exclusion, and that's a thing carved out of statute. It says if you meet this definition, you don't need a license. You don't have to apply for it. It's not like the cottage food exemption. You don't have to apply for it. If it's grown on your own property that you occupy and cultivate, you just have it. That's the exclusion. All right, adulterated food is food that contains an added substance that is poisonous or harmful to health, or food that naturally contains a poisonous or harmful substance at a level high enough to cause harm. Food that contains filthy, putrid, or diseased material. Food that's produced, stored, or prepared in unsanitary conditions, or food that's mixed with other undeclared ingredients to increase its bulk or to make it look better than it actually is. The actual definition in statute is very long. There are 15 subsections to it. If you want to read it, I encourage that. There's the link to where you can find it. Wholesale. So there's a lot of confusion around what the boundaries are between wholesale sales and retail sales. So we're going to go through that. Wholesale is a sale or delivery to any entity that will then distribute the product further. So every link in the food processing chain until food gets to the final point of sale, that's all wholesale. So starting on the left-hand side here, from the farm to a processing facility is a wholesale sale. From the processing facility to a distributor is wholesale. From the distributor to a retail store or a restaurant or an institution, that is wholesale. The only thing that's retail is the sale to the end consumer. That's the person who's going to eat the food themselves or give it or serve it to family, household members, or non-paying guests. So that retail point of sale is the store, could be a grocery store, could be an on-farm store, could be a farmer's market. That point of sale is the only thing that is retail. So, regulation of product to the farm. I call this the two-step dance because it's kind of a back and forth. Farmers that process their own produce under product to the farm are not subject to the requirements placed on licensed food processors in Minnesota's statute and rule, but farmers are required to sell only safe, non-adulterated food. So if you're a farmer processing your own product, how do you prove that you're selling safe, non-adulterated food? You prove it by voluntarily following the same food safety procedures mostly as what's required of licensed food processors and documenting that you did that. So that's the two-step. It's not a requirement, but you have to only sell non-adulterated food, and you may have to prove that that's what you're doing. Is the product of the farm adulterated? So if a Department of Ag or Department of Health inspector is out there in the world and they see that you're selling product to the farm, how do they assess whether that product is safe? If they're looking at the growing conditions and they see conditions that raise concerns about food safety, they would look at the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, produce safety rule standards. If they see processed food out there in the world and they have concerns about it, they have the authority to inspect your processing location, even though you're not licensed. Minnesota statutes are very clear that they have the authority to inspect. And then they would assess whether you're following those current good manufacturing practices standards. And if you are, they would assume that it's not adulterated. And if you're not, they could assume that it is adulterated and then mark that product for destruction. So what are those current good manufacturing practices, or CGMPs? Those are federal standards for sanitation facilities and operating processes used in the production of food at that wholesale level. So when you're going to be selling it to schools, restaurants, grocery stores, institutions. CGMPs are part of the Code of Federal Regulations, and they are typically adopted by reference at the state level, which means the state of Minnesota says we adopt these federal standards, and we're using them as the basis for our state regulations. They're enforced by FDA, and the FDA delegates that enforcement to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Again, if you want to read them, you are most welcome to. There's the link. The slide deck is in that Z-linked drive folder, by the way. Here's an example of a very rural community center kitchen that meets CGMPs for some forms of food processing. There are actually a couple of licensed wholesale food manufacturers that use this kitchen for their production of pickles and salsa and jam and jelly. This kitchen is not fancy, obviously. There's not a heck of a lot of stainless steel in here. The sinks are stainless steel, but the countertops are Formica. The cabinetry is wood. It's sealed wood. It's smooth. It doesn't have a lot of carving or fancy stuff on it, so it's cleanable. The floors are vinyl tile. Not a fancy place at all, but it could work for a lot of processing. So the triple wash sinks are under that double window at the far end there. Here's another view of the kitchen, the side of it. The hand washing sink is under the double window on the left. It's actually a double sink, so hand washing on one side, produce washing on the other side. You do need to have separate hand washing and produce washing sinks in a kitchen that meets CGMPs. And there is a ventilation hood over that kitchen range. So general facility features for a space that's going to meet CGMPs, you want smooth, cleanable, durable, non-porous surfaces. I've got that two-step dance picture here because the CGMPs in the federal guidelines do not specify ANSI certified anything. However, the way that you ensure that you have an adequate food contact surface or triple wash sink or other type of sink is to look for that certification. ANSI is actually the certifying body, and then the certifications would be something like NSF, National Sanitation Foundation. If you see that NSF sticker on the sink or the stainless steel countertop, you know that it meets food contact guidelines. And then a mop sink and a range hood. There's a ton more detail in the publication called Finding a Food Processing Space for Produce in that public drive folder. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture folks really came through. They put together a detailed list of types of materials that are preferred or acceptable or unacceptable for each type of thing you might find in a kitchen. So it's very helpful. I'm going to talk just a little bit about kitchen terminology here. So, licensed kitchen is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and in most places in the state, it's not a thing. Okay. Licensed kitchen is a license category that only exists in Minneapolis, Minnetonka, and some parts of Hennepin County outside of some of the other incorporated cities in the county. In those areas, they have this licensed kitchen category, and what it is a license for the owner of the kitchen to be allowed to rent it out to various users. Everywhere else, there are just kitchens. There is not a licensed kitchen category anywhere outside of those few areas in the state. So if you're not in Minneapolis or Minnetonka or those some parts of Hennepin County, you can use any space that meets CGMPs for product to the farm processing. Actually, even in those areas, you can use them. You can use any space for product to the farm because, again, it's excluded from licensing. So, um, it, you don't have that requirement to use the licensed kitchen even in those areas. However, you might want to because they're well appointed and often have some management help on site. Some other terms you may hear in reference to kitchens that may be available for processing work. Certified kitchen, commercial grade kitchen, community commercial kitchen, incubator, registered, rental, shared use. They have slightly different meanings in some cases. That document that I referred to goes through all of these in more detail and may be helpful. I do want to point out that certified kitchen and registered kitchen are not legal terms either. They don't have a legal meaning. So sometimes I hear certified kitchen used to mean what the person saying it thinks of as a licensed kitchen, but there is no certified kitchen category in state of Minnesota law or rule or any place else. It's not a thing. And registered kitchen, there is a registration process with the Food and Drug Administration if you're going to be shipping interstate. But the FDA does not use the term registered kitchen, and that doesn't have a legal meaning either. All right, we are going to talk about the current good manufacturing practices for a facility where you might do food processing. So you want to keep grounds and processing spaces clean and free of debris, have trash cans with tight-fitting lids so there's not open trash, contaminating your space. Any culls, you want to go into cull disposal bins and get those emptied regularly. Keep all your areas in good repair, no chipping paint or broken tiles or things like that. You want to set up your space for easy workflow and movement of produce into, through, and out of your facility. Here's a big one. Store all your dry ingredients and supplies at least 6 inches above the floor and 12 inches away from walls. That enables cleanliness. If there's ever a water flooding issue and your stuff is at least 6 6 inches above the floor, you might be okay and not have to throw things away. If it's 12 inches away from the walls, you're not creating a cozy little habitat for rodents back there. There must be a toilet facility in close proximity to the processing space, preferably within the same building. However, for some on-farm processing situations, if your processing space is really close to your house, you might be able to use the bathroom in your house. Toilet facilities must have their own dedicated hand washing sink, and the processing space must have its own dedicated hand washing sink. You cannot use the bathroom sink for washing your hands to work in the processing space. You can't interchange those. You need those two separate sinks. Keep processing areas well lit with shatterproof lighting and keep the processing areas well ventilated. So these current good manufacturing practices aren't like really crazy difficult things. They're basic sanitation and cleanliness. Some more of them: keep pets and domestic animals out of your processing space. Put in place measures to keep rodents, insects, and birds out of there. Before starting work on each processing day, inspect all areas for signs of pests. If any of you have had the FSMA produce safety rule or GAPS training, these things might start sounding familiar because it's the same sorts of things that you hear with those GAPS trainings for on-farm produce production. Don't use baited traps indoors. In an indoor food processing space, you cannot have bait because that will draw critters in. You can use a tin cat type of trap that does not have bait. If traps are used, create a map of the trap locations and check them regularly. Control who can go into the processing space, only workers. Remove gloves and aprons when going out of the processing space. Wash hands when coming back in. None of the eating, drinking, chewing gum, or chewing tobacco, or smoking, or cell phone usage should be allowed in the processing space. You can have a separate break area for those activities. Again, really similar to what you may have heard with GAPS training. Personnel health and hygiene, again, very similar to the GAPS training. Workers don't work if they have a foodborne illness or have been exposed to someone with a foodborne illness. And the symptoms of that would be vomiting, diarrhea, jaundice, or fever, which could indicate that something's coming on, right? Even if someone isn't vomiting yet. Hand washing. Lots of different points when somebody should be washing their hands. I'm not going to go into all of those because many of you have heard that, after using the toilet, after touching your face or hair, after touching your clothes, all of those things. Wear clean clothing in the processing space. If it is happening on farm and you've been working outdoors in the field, change clothes, keep hair clean and secure hair. Remove rings and bracelets and wash those hands. Keep the fingernails trimmed short and clean. Wear gloves if there's nail polish involved. Use dedicated footwear, especially if it's on-farm processing and you've been walking through fields, maybe yards, maybe livestock pens even. Get clean footwear on before going into that food processing space. Okay, again, there's a lot more about the space in those documents in the Drive folder. There is a product of the farm CGMPs document in there that was written primarily by Maureen Omolo, and that has much more detail. Allergen CGMPs. So there are 9 major allergens recognized by the FDA and a lot more minor ones that affect fewer people that aren't the official FDA allergens. So it's important to be careful when you're processing food that people are going to eat and you have no idea what they may be allergic to. So minimize allergen cross contact. Keep allergenic foods out of the processing environment when possible. For product to the farm produce, you're not going to be adding fish or shellfish or milk or eggs to that, most likely. Um, when you're processing product to the farm, you do need to, if you're using your farm products like eggs, you do need to adhere to approved source requirements for the eggs. So we're really talking about produce only products here. So you might have tree nuts, you might have soy or sesame. We're not going to talk about the animal products. Uh, so handle as few allergens at a time as possible. Separate food items and ingredients that may be allergens. If you are handling allergens, use dedicated cutting boards and utensils for them and thoroughly clean those after using them with allergens and thoroughly wash hands after handling allergens. So this is especially important if you're using a space and you're doing both product to the farm and perhaps cottage food. The cottage food is much more likely to include some allergens, and if you wind up doing both things in the same space, you should put as much separation as you can, like a clean break of cleaning everything up after cottage food before you start product to the farm, maybe even doing them on different days. That clean break concept where you clean everything before you start something different is an important concept there. Readily perishable food best practices. Again, we've got that two-step dance. These are not requirements for product to the farm because these apply to licensed food businesses. However, if you're ever called upon to prove that your food is safe and not adulterated, these are the things that are going to matter. So readily perishable foods need to be in refrigeration to be safe. So if you're doing something that's going to be readily perishable, which includes a lot of the cut vegetables, certainly anything that you blanch or cook, prepare that cold holding space ahead of time. Keep readily perishable food at 45 degrees or below during transport. Keep frozen food at 10 degrees Fahrenheit or below during transport. And if you're storing frozen food, maintain it at 0 degrees or below. Traceability best practices, again, product to the farm processing would not officially legally be subject to these, but it can really help you manage your risk and help with that proof that your product is safe. So develop a lot numbering protocol, put lot number codes on your product labels and keep a record of that, paper log sheets or electronic record of some type. Okay, we're going to talk a bit about water because if you are using a rural location like that community center picture I showed that's on a private well, or if you're doing processing on farm using a private well, the water that you use is really important to consider when you're making food for people. So there's this fact sheet available, approved water supply for rural food businesses. This that goes into quite a bit of detail. There's a revision and upgrade of it under development. It's not available yet. This is still pretty good. So if there's a private well that's going to be the water supply for a food business, for product to the farm processing for sale, that private well has to have been constructed to the well code that was in place at the time that that well was installed. There must be a construction record of the well. These were required after 1974. They were required to be submitted to the state well index after 1990. If your well is older than 1990, it may not have a record in that well index. If the contractor who put it in is still in business, they may have a record. If your well is older than 1974, um, if you've been on the property or someone has been kind of continuously on the property since then, there may be a record of the well construction. If it's a long time before 1974, there probably won't be a record. In that case, it may be possible to hire a well contractor to come out and assess the well and give you an assessment. They will not do that for free. Another thing with those private wells is that isolation distances have to be maintained, and I'll show you what those are on an upcoming slide. And then water test for total coliform bacteria, E. coli, which is a subset of coliform bacteria, and nitrites and nitrates. Those are the things to test for drinkable water. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay, so isolation distances. When a well is installed by a contractor, it will meet all of these required distances from potential sources of contamination. Um, 50 feet from a livestock building, 50 feet from a feedlot, 100 feet from a liquid manure storage facility or a petroleum pipeline, on and on. All kinds of things that the well has to be distant from. So those isolation distances have to be maintained. And on farms particularly, but potentially other rural properties, over time, after that well is installed, maybe 20 years later, uh, things like this could get placed too close to that wellhead. So then the isolation distance is breached. And if you want to use that well for a licensed food business, you would have to restore that isolation distance somehow. So because it's that two-step dance, you have to prove that your food is safe, not adulterated. Um, if you're going to be doing product to the farm processing, you want to look at these isolation distances around the well and make sure that those are met. Here's the Minnesota Well Index. If you need to look up a well, either on your own property or another location where you might be working, here's where you can do it. So the red box here belongs to Kathy Zeman, the head of the Minnesota Farmers Market Association. Her well was put in so long ago that it's lost in the mists of time. Nobody even knows when it was put in exactly, and it's not in the well index. Her neighbor, the blue dot, has a well that was put in more recently, and that is in the well index. It's listed with a well ID number. It has information about the depth of the well. There's a link there to see more information that goes into great detail about the construction record. So this is where you can find out if your well has a record, and if it does, what that record is. What if your private well, wherever the kitchen location is, doesn't pass muster for processing? Your options are kind of limited. I mean, for something like a special event food stand that's really temporary, you could potentially bring in water from a municipal source, but when you're doing processing on an ongoing basis, and making it a business enterprise, you really can't do that. So your options are to install a new well or find a different location to work. We're going to talk about jurisdiction here just a bit. So the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has jurisdiction over food processing or food manufacturing. The terms are used kind of interchangeably. So processing of raw ingredients into packaged foods. And when we're talking product to the farm processing, it's going to most likely be single ingredient processed foods, right? Although if you grow both carrots and peas and want to do a mixed frozen carrot and pea blend, that's still product to the farm. But that's under jurisdiction of Department of Agriculture. Food handling. So once that product is processed and packaged, and it's ready to be sold, the food handling aspect of it also comes under Department of Ag jurisdiction. And farmers' sales of their own farm products comes under Department of Ag jurisdiction. So even though product to the farm sales and processed product to the farm sales are not licensed, they're excluded from licensing, they're still under the jurisdiction of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And there is potential for getting stuck in the food system. Usually when I do Blazing Trails training, I call it getting stuck in the food licensing system. But even if we're taking licensing out of the picture, because this is product to the farm, there are still some opportunities to get a little tangled up. And that is because Department of Agriculture and Department of Health are both operating in the food system, and they both have jurisdiction over some things. And those things don't always dovetail the way they should. If the regulatory system had been built from the ground up by an intelligent designer, these things would mesh perfectly, but that is not what happened. So Department of Ag is responsible for food products, product sales, packaged food, bulk food, things that can be used as ingredients. And Department of Health is food and beverage service. That's the thing they regulate. But those food and beverage services regulated by health are using the products that are regulated by ag. So just be alert to situations that need clarification because the Department of Health looking at food and beverage service may not quite be up to speed on product to the farm. And if they see processed product to the farm coming into a food service establishment, they may have concerns about that. So that's where there may need to be a little bit of help. Also, Department of Ag and Department of Health each have delegated authorities, cities or counties or other units that have received delegation authority to regulate food in their area, and that makes things more complicated. Here's an example map of the Minnesota Department of Health's delegated authorities. This is probably out of date. I updated it not too long ago, but there's a fair bit of churn where counties or cities drop in and out of having that delegation authority. So this is just an example showing kind of what a variation there is across the state in who is regulating the food and beverage service. If it's the light blue areas, it's the state Department of Health directly. If it's the darker blue areas, it's a local delegated authority. And then there are these 11 tribal lands within Minnesota state boundaries as well that all have jurisdiction over food systems in their territory. And those cross-border movements of food between reservation land and the rest of Minnesota can get really tricky. So don't stay stuck. Reach out for help. If there is a misunderstanding about product to the farm at some level, you can agree with your inspector to ask for clarification from supervisors, or you can contact agency supervisors on your own, or you can contact someone from one of these organizations to help you get clarification from the agencies. Myself with MISA, the Minnesota Farmers Market Association, Renewing the Countryside, we all have staff that are versed to various degrees in the food regulations. We talk to each other, we talk to the regulators all the time, and we know how to raise up issues and who to talk to, and we can help. Also, we have the Food Innovation Team, which is a body that is composed of regulators and members of the local food and sustainable agriculture community. And if there are seriously tangled up questions that need some looks at them from multiple angles, we can put it through this food innovation team and get it straightened out. So thank you. There's my contact information. I am with the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Minnesota, at least for the next little while. So you can contact me at my email address there or my cell phone number, and happy to talk further. Thank you.